So we're going to talk about cortical visual impairment. And originally I had said, we're going to learn about it, but really we're going to get an introduction. That's about how much time we have. So I'm looking forward to sharing this with you. All right, so these are the faces of kids with CVI. And it's a long video, so I'm going to skip to a specific space, but the
CVI is the leading cause of childhood
and I couldn't do it myself better.
blindness.
Maybe. No. So there's a
CVI, every person's lived experience is different. These are their stories.
Can you state your name?
Chloe. It's very slow. So there's an individual on here who talks about how CVI impacts their ability to access all aspects of their life. And as this is loading, maybe we can come back to it. And this person just describes how every part of their day, they question every single part of their day because they're not sure if their vision is giving them appropriate information. Thank you. Yeah. My kids would tell you that I yell really loudly.
Hennessy.
I wish I could get this.
My name is Grace.
Hello, my name is Crusher Stogie Wilson.
Hi, I'm Tina Jushi Carusa.
Hi, my name is Molly Heffelfinger, and I'm here with my son,
Levi.
And so these are the faces of our students with CVI, with our children with CVI. And hopefully that'll load and we'll get farther in. We'll come back to it.
See,
today's goals, we're going to talk about the cause of CVI. What causes CVI? The characteristics and phases. We know for CVI, there are specific visual behaviors that we see, and each of those gives us a range or a score of where we are in that CVI range. I want to talk to you about how CVI is diagnosed and how CVI impacts all aspects to your activities of daily living, education, and social life. So the what of CVI? What is CVI? You're going to hear it called cortical visual impairment. You're going to call it, you're going to hear cerebral visual impairment. But overall, it's a neurological visual impairment. We know that our ocular system only provides a small fraction of what we see. It provides the initial energy input, but our brain accepts all that energy, all of that input, and creates a meaning from that. And so that's lots of times for our kids who have some type of neurological dysfunction, this is where vision falls apart in the visual processing piece. CVI is the leading cause of visual impairment in children in the United States and in developed countries. And so, as I said earlier, right, the vision happens mostly in our brain, and more than 40% of our brain is devoted to neurological function and neurological interpretation. And that being said, the eyes receive the information and the brain makes sense of that information and interprets that. Why do our kids have CVI? This is your long list of CVI. We can have congenital CVI. Anything that will disrupt neurological function will also have the capacity to interrupt the way our brain interprets visual information. We have congenital and we have acquired CVI. Acquired CVI typically happens after a child is born and any time throughout their life. Non-accidental head trauma could be an acquired CVI, a car accident, accidental head trauma, any type of stroke or near drowning, anything that limits the oxygen to our brain. And so how do we diagnose CVI? As an educator, I'm a simple educator. I work for the Deafblind Project. I work with kids all day long and their teams and their parents. I have a special niche in the area of CVI. but I'm not allowed to diagnose because I'm not a medical professional. I can provide you with information regarding an educational impact and how their vision keeps them from fully accessing all information, but I can't diagnose your child. That's going to come from an ophthalmologist, from an optometrist, from a neurologist, a neuro-ophthalmologist, a developmental neurologist. That's the field of people who are going to help you with that diagnosis. Lots of times with the ophthalmologist that I work with here in the area, they'll request that the parents bring the assessment that's been completed by the school system to help them determine the presence of CVI. We want to look for the specific presence of those 10 characteristics that I mentioned, those specific visual behaviors. And that comes through an educational assessment. I personally use the CVI range assessment that was created by Dr. Christine Lansing. And it has been found reliable. And in my own experience, it's very effective. So these are the characteristics of CVI. These are when I'm doing an assessment, these are the 10 areas that I'm going to be looking for when I'm working with your child. Can they look at color? Can they look at one color? Can they look at something that's 3 colors? Can they look at something that's 5 colors or beyond that? Do I need to move something to get them to look? If I move it, will they look? If I stop moving it, will they stop looking or will they keep looking? Think about latency, and latency is the time it takes for your child to look after I presented something. So if I give them their favorite toy, and I'll say, "Here, Stephanie, here's your toy." How long does it take her to look to the space after I presented it? And that gap of time between when I presented it and when they've looked, that's visual latency. And look at visual fields. Will your child look in their right visual field, in their left, in their superior, in their inferior, and their central? Will they look at an object that's presented in each one of those visual fields? Light. Does your child need light to help them to look? Do they stare at the overhead light? Do they stare out the window? Does light keep them from looking at the object that I'm asking them to look at? Does light help them bring their attention to the target that we're asking them to look at? Is light impeding their ability to use their vision, or can we use light to help support use of vision? We're going to look at distance viewing. How far away can they see something? How close does it have to be? We think about novelty. Can your child look at something that's new? Or will they only look at the things that they already know? Or will they look at things that are kind of like what they know, but just a little bit different? Novelty. Complexity. Complexity is the largest group of characteristic. There are 4 subdomains to this, and it's the one that when I'm working with a student and I find that they're not using their vision the way that they typically do, this is the first area that I check. So for complexity of object, how many colors or patterns can be on this object and they will still look at it? Array, what am I presenting this object against? Can they look at their favorite toy when it's sitting on the table with the entire background of the room behind them? Or do I need to put something behind that object to help them direct their vision to it? In the environment, can people be talking and your child will still look? If I show them a target, their toy, and somebody talks, do they look away or do they keep looking? Can they continue to look at their favorite toy even when it plays music or when I take their hand and touch it? All of those things have to do with environment, complexity of the environment. Are the lights too bright? Are the lights too dim? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Their biobehavioral state, being hungry, tired, sick. All of those things impact the way our brain takes the image from our ocular system to make sense of it. And lastly, faces. Faces fall under complexity because faces are extremely complex. And so often parents will say to me, "I'm so sad my child doesn't look at me. They won't look at my face. They won't look at me when I'm talking to them." And it's all about complexity. Sometimes even when our children see us every single day, our faces change. Sometimes we have on makeup, sometimes we've combed our hair, sometimes we haven't, sometimes it's in a ponytail. All of those things change the way our face looks, which falls back into the area of novelty. Can they still find the pieces of you that make your face you? We think about reflexes. Does your child respond to a threat? If when I touch them between their eyes, will they blink? Do they know that that's a threat coming towards their face? Do they respond if I bring a toy or my hand quickly towards their face? Those are reflexes, and they're not something that we teach, they're just something that we monitor. And finally, visually guided reach is the 10th characteristic. And that is all about looking at something, being able to find it, and reaching for it. And so often we see our kiddos with CVI regard, look attention, and then turn their head and reach and grab that toy. And that's again about integrating your senses, integrating those sensory information. Is it too hard for me to motor plan, use that fine motor to reach, gross motor to reach for it, and still use my vision to interpret that action? 10 characteristics. I'm going to skip ahead one. So these are the phases. These are the phases. When we talk about the CVI range, it is scored from a 0 being no vision or very limited vision, to 10 being typical neurotypical vision. Our kids fall on the space of this. I have never in my 25 years of practice had a kid who had a 0. It didn't happen. When we provide those right interventions, we see them start to begin to use their vision. Our kids don't typically get to a 10 because when we think about, sometimes our children will use their vision well. We're reading, we're writing, we're looking at the smart board and getting information. But when we go to the gym, when we go to the cafeteria, and that sensory environment is so completely complex, they are no longer able to use their vision in the same way. So we have to make sure that when we have kiddos who are in that phase 3, that we are making sure we get information about how they use their vision across settings and in really complex environments. So that's where we are with the phases. So the phases. In phase 1, we're going to work to build consistent visual responses. So anytime we have somebody scoring between that 0 and 3, we want to make sure we're providing interventions that allow them to consistently use their vision. And when we think about vision, we think about this visual. I apologize to all the parents who have heard this 500 times. We think about visual regard out here in this space. I am not looking at it, but I know something is there. I'm going to get shape, I'm going to get gross size, I'm going to get color, but I'm not going to get detail. I'm not getting detail from visual regard. And we want to help our kids begin to bring their vision around so that now we're having visual attention. So in phase 1, we're working towards that. In phase 2, when we get over 3 up to about 7, the largest part of this range, we want our children to begin to use their vision and complete a function. So we want them to be able to look at their spoon, pick it up, and bring it to their mouth. We want them to use their vision during activities. And then in phase 3, we're continuing to work on all those things, but we want them to begin to have consistent visual interpretation. Visual interpretation. When my eyes see this thing, I have visual attention. I'm looking at this thing that you showed me. I'm interpreting the information. I'm looking at it. I'm understanding what it is. I'm connecting meaning to this thing. I know what this is, and I can connect it to an experience. Visual interpretation. We want that to occur across all settings and activities for our kids in phase 3. In phase 1, we use visual regard. Visual regard. We're using that dorsal stream. As we begin to move through, we see in phase 2, our kids are still using some visual regard. We're building that visual attention, and we're working toward visual interpretation. So we have our dorsal stream, which is really phase 1 and early phase 2, that visual regard, and our ventral visual system, which is working on that attention and interpretation. So this is visual regard. This is my friend Ben. This is his mom. Ben knows his mom. He's known her since the second he was born, right? Even before. This is how he would greet his mom for the longest time. He used visual regard. He could not look in her face. Initially, both of his parents, he greeted them that this way. I know it's you. I'm going to take It's a gross amount of information. And then after a few minutes, he turns and he looks at his mom and gives her visual attention. But he began with that visual regard. Visual attention. My eyes are on this object. It's joint visual attention here. It's beautiful. They're looking at each other. Visual attention. And so this is my friend Elliot, and Elliot is going to show you a little something about visual regard, visual attention, and visually guided reach. You can see him kind of shift his gaze away as he's thinking. His mom's supporting his head. He's looking and he's reaching. But he doesn't maintain eye contact. As if you're looking at his eyes, you can see that there are lots of times when he's touching that tablet and he's looking away from it, having a hard time integrating those senses. This is my friend Ben. I love this kid. He's the same little guy that you saw in the video in the photo with his mom. And Ben is going to play the piano for us, and we're going to see some visual regard, and we're going to see some visual attention. That complexity of the environment, of the sound of this, makes it hard for him to look, provide visual attention. He's a rock star. He needed a warm up, right? He needed that time from when he sat down to this piano, visually regarded it, took in the small pieces of information until he was ready to bring his eyes around visual attention to the target. All right, latency, one of our characteristics, another really big one for our kiddos with CVI. Remember, it's the time when something is presented to you, something is presented to our child until the time that they look. And anytime we interrupt the process of visual latency, if I think Carlos, this is Carlos, so my coworker Jen, Carlos needs about 10 seconds, 15 seconds. If I interrupt him at second 10, he has to start that clock over. And this is, I love this example of Jen and Carlos demonstrating visual latency. If Jen would have interrupted Carlos midway through his processing cycle, it would have taken twice as long. She knew that she needed to wait for him. She introduced herself. She showed him her bracelet, her identifier, and she quietly waited for him to look. So many times, we decide to up our energy. Look at me, I'm over here. I want you to look at me. All of that is complexity of the environment. We don't want that. We want that quiet wait time. All right, we have another video of Ben. Visually guided reach and visual regard. Ben loves the vacuum, and you're going to see him with his vacuum here. But he doesn't love his AAC device.
All done. More.
Does he ever look at that device? He didn't look when he reached, right? He knew it was there. He had that regard of it, but he never used his vision to reach for that device. It's a cause and effect toy. He knows if he presses anything, something, the vacuum would turn back on.
All done. Like.
You like that?
Like.
I know. I like that too. Do you
Want.
Right, and so we see the often disconnect between wanting our children to communicate effectively. Lots of our kids need AAC devices. They need the ability to have expressive communication, but we have to be so systematic in the way that we present this for our kids with CVI to ensure that they're using their vision and not just motor planning or motor memory to find the targets on here. All right, so here's another Ben. This is when Ben was little. And I want to show you the effects of complexity of the environment. This is Ben's favorite toy in all the world. He loves this toy. This first video, he is at home. It's his environment, it's quiet, it's familiar, it's his mom working with him. Life is good for Ben here. Visual attention, visually guided reach, visual attention. And now we're going to contrast that to Ben at school. So this is a moderately complex environment for Ben. I have set it up so that there is no complexity of array, right? We have a black cloth on the table. We have a board in the back that takes away all of the complexity of array behind him. There is noise in the classroom. Visual regard. Yay, he got it, right? How different is that from when he was at home? The same toy, the same kid. It's a relatively short timeline in comparison, and that's how he responded in a moderately complex environment. So many times, right, we hear he could do it if he wanted to. He just doesn't want to today. He's lazy. He's undermotivated. We have to check complexity. Complexity will support visual attention when we accommodate for visual complexity. All right, so here's been same day in a highly complex. See the array, that toy is placed on an array of a table with other things. It's loud. There is nothing there is no control of complexity here. And he's frustrated. And he needs more support. And the toy doesn't work. Remember in the first video, he was reaching and picking those toys up off the floor. He's so frustrated. I'm a mean person for putting him in that situation. But this is the effects of environmental complexity. I didn't control for array. I didn't control for sound. And he is telling me that through his behavior. All right, visual interpretation. Can I look at this bowl of food and know that it's my bowl, that it's my bowl of food? That when I see this thing, I know that I'm going to go to the table and have something to eat. So it's not just a matter of looking at it. It's a matter of I'm looking at it and I'm connecting meaning. I know that when I see this, it's time to eat. Same with the undergarment. When I see this, do I know that it's time to go to the bathroom? That it's time to get a change? Visual interpretation. Looking at it is one thing. Understanding the meaning of it is another. All All right. We all know what this is, right? We know what an elevator button is. There are no words unless you read Braille. How do you know what this means? How do we visually interpret these buttons on the elevator? Experience is one, right? I've seen somebody push that bottom button and the doors close. Or I've seen somebody push that top button and the doors open for somebody to come get on the elevator that was running late to catch it before the doors closed. Experience. And we do that lots of times. We and our children with neurotypical vision do that incidentally, but our kids with visual impairment don't have the luxury of incidental learning. We have to specifically, intentionally teach every single thing we want them to visually interpret. So we would talk about the shape of these things, how there's a line in the middle, how the arrows pointing in mean that door is going to close, and how the arrows pointing out means that door is going to open. All right, visual interpretation again. This is a big one for our kids. What do I have? I bet as you're all sitting there, you're beginning to pick out the pieces of this mumbo jumbo image that you recognize. You're picking out the salient features of specific objects, targets that you understand. And so if I said to you, can you find the eagle? What's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to pull from your memory the image of an eagle, and then you're going to use that image that you have stored in your brain to look for the pieces in this mess that fit the label of eagle. Again, our kids with CVI don't have the luxury of doing that. We have to specifically, intentionally teach how to decipher something that is a mess like this. So eagle. There's our eagle, right? And so after I've shown it to you and I go back, you're going to have an easier time of finding it in that mess. That's what we have to do for our kids. We have to help them understand each piece of an image or an object so that they can find it even when the environment isn't controlled. Now let's try it again. This time I want you to find the grasshopper. What salient feature of grasshopper are you going to use to find it amongst the mess of this? Probably color, right? Because that's what stands out here in this. So if I show you grasshopper, to me, it looks like he's boxing. Cricket, whatever this animal is. I've been calling him a grasshopper. If I go back, now you know where to look. You know what to look for. You know the pieces of this that you can put together to make sense of. Questions? I flew through that so quickly. I hope you have lots of questions.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Becky. We do have some questions from the Slido, and I think this is a big one that we'd all love to hear about. Is the question is, our ophthalmologist says my daughter has no issues and thinks her avoidant gaze is just behavioral. How do we know what is CVI and what is, quote, autistic traits? And I know there's a lot here, and this is a hard diagnosis for us all to get from our providers. So can you talk a little bit about how we might help guide them and how we can do that?
Absolutely. And so one of the things that help us to understand that it's CVI is a clear ocular health exam, right? There is nothing wrong with my eyes, or there is something, I have nearsightedness or farsightedness, some type of refractive error that I can correct, but the way I use my vision isn't explained by my ocular health. That's the first thing you want to point out to your doctor. Yeah, they have a mild case of nearsightedness, but they're still not looking. Do they have a birth history that's relevant to neurological dysfunction? And do they respond to these characteristics? Those are the three things that we want to bring to our ophthalmologist to say, I understand that you're telling me that my kid's eyes are healthy, but they're not using their vision the way that they should. It's really important to get that CVI assessment completed by a teacher with a visually impaired who's knowledgeable in CVI. They are going to pull out each one of those 10 characteristics, talk about how they impact your child's ability to access information, and share that with the eye doctor. And if your eye doctor is not knowledgeable about CVI, you want a different eye doctor. You want to find somebody who understands what it is and how it impacts, and you want them to provide that diagnosis. In the school system, at least in Maryland, and I think in most states, you don't need a diagnosis of CVI to receive services from a teacher that's visually impaired. You only need to have proof that there is an impact to their access to their education. It helps to have the CVI diagnosis because then the school can't question your impact. And how it relates to autism, that's so tricky, right? Because it does look similar. But what I found with CVI is that the lack of visual attention doesn't has to do with complexity. And so if I modify what's happening, if I modify the target that I'm showing you, if I modify the environment and the array, do I get visual attention now? So those changes help us to show that it's visual processing and not necessarily autism.
Thanks. Along those lines of bringing some of this information to our providers, there's a question here, and Amanda, I think this is partially you, is can we get some of the links to some of those YouTube videos so that we can take these private videos, or can we take them to our providers? Amanda's giving us a thumbs up and saying we'll post some links later.
Okay.
So, and especially I think for the folks watching online who haven't gone through these assessments in the last couple of days, can you describe and talk about how you're accurately assessing the CVI in nonverbal children, and what you've been, and talk a little bit about what you've been doing here this weekend?
Of course. When I work with a student who is nonverbal, but I think anybody that I've had the great opportunity to work with this week, one of the first things I ask you is, what is their expressive communication? How do I know what they're telling me? And sometimes that's gesture, sometimes it's an AAC device, sometimes it's sign language, sometimes it's whatever it is. And I use all of that when I'm assessing, but what I'm looking for is the visual behaviors. So if I'm showing a student or your child something that's 6 colors and they are not looking regardless of the background, regardless of the control of the environment, and I change that to 4 colors, and now I have visual attention, right? This is how I'm assessing the complexity of that object. 5 colors, can't do it. 4 colors, I can do it, but it's really hard. 3 colors, spot on. I know that when I'm introducing the complexity, when I'm thinking about color and the amount of color and patterns on that, and I'm at an instructional level, I want an object that's 2 or 3 colors. So that's how I'm assessing color in a student who is nonverbal. They can't say, this thing is a ball, or this thing is my piano, but they won't look. So their visual behaviors talk to me about how they're using their vision and if the thing is accessible. So I do that for each of the characteristics. Do I have to move it to get you to look? Do I have to keep moving it for you to continue to look? I don't need words for that. I need visual behaviors. Those behaviors are how I determine where your child falls on the CVI range. Language helps. Language is so helpful, but lots of times that language comes through gestures and body language.
Thank you. Here's a question. Are there practices or treatments that can help improve that visual latency that we saw?
Yes, of course. And across the board. So what we know about CVI is it can get better, right? The brain is this magical, wonderful thing that when we provide the right interventions, we can create these new visual pathways that help build increased visual attention and interpretation. So when we provide the accommodations that are specific for the phase that your child is in, and we consistently provide those across settings and activities, we begin to see them use their vision more appropriately, more consistently, more effectively. And so it's the accommodations. It's not therapy. It's not a medical treatment. It is educational strategies and accommodations that help them to see things. When they see one thing, then they're able to see 2 things, and then 3 things, and then 4 things. So it's building on those accommodations.
It's a question about the exam being covered by insurance, and I think the extension of that is, are there strategies that you would recommend and a process that families can go through that would help get the ultimate diagnosis exam covered by insurance from an ophthalmologist, are there precursors that can be done in school settings or something like that that will help get, convince insurance, because that's what we all have to do all the time, right?
Right. So the wonderful thing about, I use the CVI range by Dr. Christopher Melancy, like I mentioned, and it is normed for 9 months to 18 years. And so that's our age range, but that's also our school range, right? And so these assessments are educational assessments. They are done by your school system. And so it doesn't cost us to have our school team, the professional on the school team, the teacher visually impaired, come and do this assessment. So it doesn't need to be covered by insurance because it's covered by your school system. I think that if you homeschool and your child is not in the school system and you don't have access to that, then you would have to find a provider. And I don't believe that insurance covers the educational assessment. That is a functional vision assessment.
Okay. I think that was our last question on here. I think from my perspective, this has been incredibly eye-opening to do this assessment here and to hear about this. This is, the last few months are the first time that a lot of us have heard about CVI, and this has been really interesting and eye-opening and allowing us to think about accommodations for our kids. So I'm going to thank you for doing that, Becky.
My pleasure.
Bianca, is there a way to send samples for research if we are not there this weekend?
She's going to come join our panel.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. So maybe you guys can put in the Slido, the email for the natural history study in the biobank, but we are absolutely can help collect samples remotely. So we can send you tubes in the mail and we'll send it with a prepaid FedEx bag to send it back to us. The tubes do expire, so we try to send them when we know you're going to actually go and get labs drawn. But if you're going to get labs drawn for another reason, and the phlebotomist will draw these extra tubes for you, that's a great opportunity to do that. So we work really hard with you to help coordinate getting those tubes to you and coordinating it with when it works for you and your family. We do a lot of that.